Very much, Annie. Good day, Your Majesties, Lords, ladies and gentlemen, from a somewhat drizzly London. Before we kick off this second Scotia Group Climate Dialogue, I wanted to say a few words about our host today, Institution Courage, which many of you will know of as IQ. Ever since it was launched in 2005, IQ has been at the forefront of a range of dynamic and unique initiatives to encourage global commitments to the rule of law and more generally to improve public policy making through concrete efforts to create genuine and lasting intergenerational dialogue. I thought it was worth pausing for a short moment to just remember some of the key individuals who were founding members of the Courage Council and have worked very closely with IQ's principal, Professor Dr. Malik Dahlan, who many of you will know very well. The late Professor Det Vax and the late Professor Stanley Hoffman, both very distinguished academics at Harvard University, really inspired and encouraged Professor Dahlan to put into practice the idea of setting up a genuinely independent transnational law and policy think tank. They were aided by Lord Harry Wolff, another Courage Council member, who helped convene the 2009 Qatar Law Forum of Global Leaders in Doha, which brought together academics, judges, and practitioners from around the world to discuss how to improve the resiliency and institutions to protect the rule of law. IQ has certainly been on a journey over the last few years, and I certainly recall being in the audience at University College London back in 2013, when the I-Platform for Global Change was launched. It has worked with refugees in Zaatari, Jordan, to give them access to online skills so they could learn about renewable energy technologies. We were very fortunate that His Royal Highness Prince Al Hassan bin Talal, another IQ Council founding member and a source of great inspiration, also helped to launch the video series in collaboration with Montfort Communications, encouraging people to give their ideas about global commitments to the rule of law. And I-Platform has also hosted some very provocative but timely ideas, the Marshall Plan for the Middle East, the Jerusalem First initiative, and then COVID hit, obviously dramatically changing the world worked, but in some ways speeding up and encouraging intergenerational dialogue and discussions, something that we talked about for a long time. And it was another towering figure in the history of IQ, the late Shade Ahmed Zaki Yamani, who sadly passed away earlier this year, who famously said, "The Stone Age did not end for lack of stone, and the oil age will end long before the world runs out of oil." And it was this vision about the urgent need to help transition our fragile planet to a new energy age that helped give birth to the Scotia Group. And the I-Platform will be hosting ideas connected to some of the discussions which you'll hear today, and also future dialogue initiatives. We're also very proud to be launching the Professor Stanley Hoffman and Professor Louise Richardson Prize, which will be seeking innovative ideas around climate action from young people all around the world, and very specifically in Africa, where the COP27 meetings will be held. The urgency of all this is also shown by the fact that Professor Dahlan is really wanting this to be an exclamation mark and a full stop on IQ, and to some extent on this chapter of his career. He'll be stepping down from IQ at the end of 2021, and he really wants this last burst of activity and all of you on this call today to be part of the journey to support and encourage lasting policy change arising out of both the COP26 summit and also encouraging the ideas which are being discussed today and in future dialogues to take root and to flourish. So I'm now delighted to hand you over to Kirsty Duncan MP, one of the members of the Scotia Group's Inception Commission, who will begin today's dialogue.
Thank you, Annie. Thank you, Alex, Your Majesty, lords, ladies, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends, good morning or afternoon or evening, and welcome to the second group dialogue and Majlis. My name is Kirsty Duncan, and I have the privilege of serving as today's moderator for what promises to be an exciting Scotia Group dialogue. For those of you who are new to the Scotia Group, we are a global alliance of leading experts and internationalists brought together by Professor Malik Dahlan. The Scotia Group's goal is to lend support, bring new perspectives, and help ensure that COP26 in Glasgow is a success. Let me take this opportunity to thank you all for joining us and for your time, expertise, and willingness to engage. We're looking forward to hearing your ideas to urgently address the existential threat of climate change. The science tells us that we are T-minus 9 years for having carbon emissions by 2030, and the scale of economic and societal change required to achieve is unprecedented. We have to be ambitious. We have to move beyond far off national pledges, with countries failing to make their commitments to delivering practical, urgent change on the ground in the next 9 years. That's what today's dialogue tackles. Delivering climate change at the community, city, state, subnational level. That is where we all live, and the importance of ensuring that people have a voice in decision making, necessary financing to see projects to fruition, and peer-to-peer learning opportunities. We have two tremendous speakers. First, we will hear from Sarah Millar, who is the COP26 coordinator for the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group, a collaboration platform and pooled fund aiming to facilitate greater donor practitioner engagement. Next, we will hear from Dr. Andrew Kerr from EIT Climate Kick, Europe's largest public-private innovation partnership for climate action. Each of our speakers will present for about 10 minutes, and then we will open the floor to questions and comments. If you wish to speak, please use the raised hand function. We will be taking a list. We will go in the order in which the questions came in. In order to ensure as much dialogue as possible, we will ask that your intervention be no longer than 2 minutes. If you would prefer to send your question or comment in writing, please use the chat below. The important information you will provide will be captured as we look forward to consensus recommendations on the way to Glasgow. Here's to a good discussion, and Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Kirsty, for that lovely introduction, and hello everybody. Thank you very much for having me, and a note of thanks to Professor Malik for inviting me and to have this opportunity to present the pact to you all today. As Kirsty said, I work for an organisation called the Climate Emergency Collaboration Group. We are a pooled philanthropic platform. We're working with some of the largest climate philanthropies, and we're doing coordination around COP26, but also with an arc to COP27 in Africa, and then COP28 the following year. So part of my presentation is to provide a little bit of an expose into how we're trying to set the meta frame for Glasgow. And so what I'm going to run you through very quickly, it's a bit of a whistle-stop tour of quite a big concept. So I'm looking forward to your feedback and discussion. So what is the problem? What's the rationale for what we're proposing? What is the pact, and what's going to happen next? So I'll start with what the problem is. I think because of a variety of reasons, we're all struggling to reconcile what COP26 is all about. There are lots of reasons for that: the postponement, COVID, the science telling us that climate impacts are happening with more frequency and more severity. We're all grasping this very difficult, complex international problem, and we're struggling with the scale of the solution required, and there are lots of questions about whether the UN and the UNFCCC forum is the right place to be able to solve that, and whether multilateralism is able to do that. It's also in recognition of the fact that a lot of the climate decisions are being taken elsewhere, and that's potentially a good thing. It demonstrates that we're moving from the target setting to the implementation. And so the decision and the inflection points, particularly in 2021, because we're almost playing catch up on the international summits that didn't take place last year. Lots of the climate decisions are being taken in the G7, the G20. Otherwise, it would have been the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting that has been postponed, but there are lots of other decision points throughout the year. And there is sort of no way of sweeping up all of those decisions at the moment and to bring it back into the COP itself. So that's a little bit of the rationale for why we need a bit of a North Star and a bit of a rallying call for both parties and this wave of civil society, businesses, non-state actors to be able to swing behind and to be able to cut through some of the problems that we're encountering. I think most of you will recognise that when you're advocating for something, if it's a great big long shopping list of requests, that's very difficult to land because people don't know what you're prioritising and what really matters and what's at the core of the thing. And at the moment, what the movement has, what countries have, is a great big long shopping list, and none of it is cutting through. We've certainly seen that ahead of the G7. I think people are looking for a single meeting to solve all of the world's ills, and we know that the things don't work like that. But in order to provide some of the cut through, we have to have a bit of a North Star rallying point. And so the pact is designed to do some of that. So what is the pact? At the moment, it's an alignment tool. It's a bit of a media guide. It's a bit of a mnemonic to catch all of the things that might happen and which would contribute to a successful outcome at COP26. So the P of the pact stands for promises. And basically this is the solidarity bucket. So how are we demonstrating that we are delivering on the promises that we have made through the Paris Agreement and well before the Paris Agreement? Because if we cannot demonstrate that we are delivering on promises that we have made, we cannot make future promises and expect anybody to have any confidence in our ability to deliver on it. It's a trust issue. And we know that the last 5-6 years have been a very low ebb in terms of multilateralism. We know that the world is at a very low ebb in terms of confidence and trust between countries. And so we have to rebuild some of the trust that we captured in 2015 that enabled us to get the Paris Agreement in the first place. So essentially, it's a solidarity bucket. And what I mean by that is it's a finance bucket, it's a loss and damage bucket, it's a climate adaptation bucket. Are we providing the means for all countries to be able to adapt and be resilient to the impacts of climate change? It won't surprise many of you to know that the A is for ambition, but it's a little bit more than ambition, because this goes back to the promises aspect. Anybody can make a promise about how they're going to cut their emissions, but unless you do the doing part, it's just a promise and you're not fulfilling it. So it's almost a double A, it's almost ambition, accountability. And so it's, are the nationally determined contributions adding up to what they need to add up? Is the 1.5 degree window still open? Do we have the confidence and the environmental integrity of some of the schemes and some of the things that will help us to get to net zero? And last but not least, catalysing transformation is the C and the T part. And this is a little bit of a sweep up of all of the actions that are taking place outside of the formal processes. So it's in recognition of things like powering past coal. It's in recognition of efforts to shift the finance system. It's in recognition of things like internal combustion engine phase out. It's in recognition of campaigns around improving nature and biodiversity. So it's a bit of a sweeping up of what is happening in the real economy and whole of society that can give us confidence and assurance that we're taking this all extremely seriously. But then how do we go about accounting for that activity, that action, that excitement, and how are we catalysing it and making sure that we're sharing the learning, we're doing the networking, and we're making sure that things can happen at the pace and scale required. So what's going to happen next with the pact? We are socialising it as an alignment tool. So in an ideal world, the pact would be, and I'm going to use this analogy for you, it would be almost the flagship of the flotilla of all of the effort to arrive safely at COP26 Island and to get a successful outcome. So it's not designed to replace or supersede all of the calls and all of the asks. It's a prism through which, and it's a platform through which other people's asks, other people's campaigns, other people's advocacy calls can be viewed and can be elevated. The mnemonic of pact has been chosen for a reason. I think everybody would recognise what a pact is. it's deliberately loaded with that good faith actor jeopardy, and making sure that we have a coming back together after this very difficult period of COVID, of this very difficult period of perhaps multilateralism being at an incredibly low ebb, which I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, and almost having a new shake hand moment and a recommitment, almost a renewal of the Paris Agreement vows, so that we can all recognise and look each other in the eye and understand that we are doubling down and we are recommitting to delivering on the promises that we made. And by the time we get to Glasgow, it will be almost 6 years ago. So that's the pact. Hopefully at some point it can be used as a vehicle to bring some of those things into the negotiations themselves. And sort of one of the questions that I would have to this particular expert Scotia group is all of your experience in turning political commitment and political initiatives and making the bridge into actioning that, and having it as a landing ground, particularly in legal text and particularly in the UNFCCC. So I'd welcome your thoughts on integrating the high-level political into very practical actions from a legal, but also from a political perspective. So thank you for listening, and I'm really looking forward to your questions.
Thank you, Sarah, for your opening remarks. So appreciated. I think what you've said so clearly is the importance for a North Star, a unified rallying call for Glasgow. And with so many competing asks, cutting through is difficult. So there needs to be a simple way to explain and elevate those asks, and that many of the climate decision points this year lie outside the UNFCCC negotiations, so that there needs to be a bridge between political moments, for example, the G7, the G20, to the UNFCCC, to see how we're all doing. Thank you for your remarks. And now it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Andy Kerr. Andy, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kirsty, for your kind words. We have heard from Sarah about the pact and specifically about the need for an iconic clean transformation. What I want to talk about and really get your views in this group is about the how. How do we help the COP, the UNFCCC, to enable, to empower transformative climate action around the world? And today, explicitly, I'm going to talk about how we might build on the surge of subnational ambition and action in communities around the world. And by communities, I'm thinking very much in terms of a broad definition of communities, so communities of practice and of purpose, as well as of place. So I'm going to make, in my 7 or 8 minutes, I'm going to make 3 points, and I'm going to offer you a proposal. The first point is a very simple one. As Kirsty said, we're at T-9, we're less than a decade away. So the focus of COP has to be on climate action, by which I mean the practical change on the ground that we need communities to see, renovating our homes, transport systems, renovating our neighborhoods, our cities, our regions around the world. And I think my belief is that we need to get this practical climate action at the center of, at the heart of the COP conversation, rather than the rather abstract high-level technical negotiations that go on at the moment, because that's the way to make the connection with people in terms of the sorts of changes that are required. So that's a very simple point. My second point is about the power of subnational and community action in that broad sense of community. There was a time, I'm going back 20 plus years now, where we thought that we could solve much of the climate problem with a tweak of national economic policy, a marginal carbon tax, a climate change levy, if you're in the UK perhaps, or a national energy policy that supported a particular technology, and that somehow magically these things would provide the silver bullet that would sort out the climate problem. But I think we now recognize that actually effective climate action is the culmination of multiple decisions and choices at a really rather granular level, made by different actors, by individuals, by organizations, by local and national authorities at different scales, in the international scene, at national, at subnational, and at very local. We're also seeing cities, states, regions take on more ambitious targets and enact climate action far more readily than we're seeing national governments. And they're driving practical change in ways that engage their people and livelihoods. And this is, I think, the key point, because they're very close to that, the real change on the ground. And it's worth noting that we're trying to make our rather complex societies change their behavior in a very short space of time. And this cannot be done with a single lever of change, a policy framework, or a technology. It actually has to involve civic legitimacy. We have to be working with communities to build and enable their future vision, not simply impose change on them. And yet at the moment, there's this complete disconnect between the subnational action happening on the ground and the COP processes and negotiations that are going on. So the question again from me to you is, how do we bring this key catalyst of climate action into the heart of the COP26 process? And the third point I want to make is that we need to scale climate action, transformative action across multiple places, countries, cities, states, regions around the world at a quite extraordinary pace. Now, there are different models for achieving that. And often what we tend to see is it sort of defaults back to some centralized agency or a body responsible for sharing knowledge that, you know, and know-how. But in practice, the experience that many of us have had is that the granularities, and I'm thinking here about local policy, culture, skill sets and capacities, citizen engagement, behaviors, access to markets, local supply chains, that actually they make transformative change mean that some high-level central body very rarely has the impact that we would hope. And they typically end up presenting very generic solutions rather than the specifics that are required to deliver the change on the ground. So my experience of working with subnational entities who are actually enacting the action on the ground is that knowledge exchange typically is built on trust. It's built on peer networks. It's built on building local capacity. And trust comes from shared experiences, from shared cultures, from shared practices. So they're kind of peer-to-peer networks of communities, if you will. And knowledge is also diffused through the likes of markets, through transactions, because you need shared understanding and infrastructure to make them work. So if we want to scale climate action at the speed and at the scale required, I would assert that we really need to put the power of these networks, these systems of trust, of shared endeavors, and the way in which we actually operate as a society, as opposed to how we might like it to operate, absolutely at the heart of what we're doing. So those are my 3 points. So let me just finish with my proposal for the group, and I'd be keen to get your thoughts on it. One of the challenges that we have is that we're not, firstly, making the most of these powers of these networks, of these communities of practice and of place, where knowledge exchange is taking place, where ambitious efforts are being made, and where delivery is actually starting to happen. We also know that generalized commitments to support other countries has come to not naught, but very little. In other words, promises that we would supply know-how and technology, promises that we would supply vast amounts of finance have not been delivered. And partly that is because we're putting these efforts into supporting big multilateral organizations, which are a long way from practical experiences on the ground. So I would say, why not build on our knowledge of our networks and our knowledge of how the world actually works to try and say, let's have something which I call the linked arms proposal, which is that each city, state and region, each country that commits to a robust, by which I mean a Paris-aligned or a science-based target, also commits to supporting 2 other cities, states, regions, or countries. It's very simple. It's a partnering and a twinning approach. It's built on using shared cultural, social, economic ties. And the advantage of it is that it avoids the sort of politically difficult proposition for governments of committing large amounts of cash and know-how to general multilateral organizations distant from individuals and communities. And it's worth just reminding ourselves, I mean, the UK, you know, this very year when it's hosting G7, it's hosting COP, has just cut its overseas development funding to the poorest countries by 30%. So these generalized statements or promises are not effective. And the other thing that this proposal does, this twinning, this linked arms, is that it grounds the debate in supporting and sharing practical action accessing resources, accessing know-how with somewhere else, with a place with close links. So that's the proposal I'd love to hear people's thoughts on. And I think, Kirsty, I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Andy. We so appreciate both you and Sarah and your excellent remarks today. What I've heard, Andy, and I hope I'm reflecting this well, is the need for practical climate action, meaning measurable on-the-ground changes in housing, transport, land use. Those need to be at the heart of the COP process, rather than the abstract, high-level technical negotiations. And to scale climate action, we need to use the power of networks, of communities, rather than centralized agencies and your linked arms process of each leading city, state, and region supporting two others to achieve similar goals. Leverages actual social behavior. Thank you so much, Andy. And now I'm going to turn the discussion to the person who brought us all together, Professor Malik Dahlan.
Good morning, everyone. I send greetings from, if you can hear me, just to make sure, yes, from Cambridge, Massachusetts, right across from Harvard University, where it looks like it's been completely quiet, but I'm glad that I'm seeing my dear friend Melanie Kamet to feel at least I'm here. I want to, I'll be introducing our newest members, but so please do stick around for the latter part, because that's where all the action happens. But let me pay my respect to Her Majesty. It's always good to see you, and thank you for your support. President Carlos Salinas, thank you for your support and continued push for us to come up with actual solutions. I have a very powerful script in front of me, which I'm not going to read, and I know the Secretariat is not going to be happy with me. And I've asked Ted to put the later part in the chat box, but I just want to make a couple of important points. I'm really talking about my specific contribution here is not the themes we've discussed before, which is T-9, the importance of this moment, how we simply don't have any option but to make this work in some form or another. But I just want to talk about my struggle as a policy expert or following our methodology of policy planning, which Alex sort of talked about. To give you an idea, I came in after a year and a half to my apartment here. This is during the COVID lockdown. And it did feel like I was somehow in a time warp where things were left exactly where they are. The pens, a chapter in a book that I was reading about the world trading system and so on. But more importantly, I was really focused, my pure focus before leaving my sabbatical at Harvard, returning to London, where I literally went into the lockdown, was actually working on a pre-Trump plan on the final status of Jerusalem. So this was a project called Jerusalem First. And, you know, I've resolved we failed in so many ways, even though we've made huge, huge steps forward. And for a university like Harvard to embrace the project was a huge success. But it also tells you how policy can be diverted very quickly into a wrong direction. And even though I'm being asked by friends to get involved right now with the mediation and so on, I just simply said, we can't. We've offered our best solutions. And if we failed, it is what it is. It's a sad situation, but right now, the priority is the climate. And it's because there's a limitation with capacity that can be offered and specific proposals that could be workable. We have to follow process. And what I'm trying to say here is, frankly, dealing with climate as a construction of complexity has proven to me that it's more complicated than the Middle East crisis. Views are very strong to deal with the political spectrum. I have, in a way, it's ironic because an Arab from Mecca could seem to be a controversial person, but it's actually taking a step back and trying to sort through right-wing politics, left-wing politics in the West, trying to understand what's going on in China. It is a helpful way to see middle grounds. So what's the secret to a really fantastic and successful policy proposal? Policy must have impact. If it is not impactful, it's not legitimate. It's not worth this meeting. We came together with a very specific mandate, especially from Her Majesty and President Salinas. It said, look, 3 to 4 proposals that are very solid. And also, if this is going to be a talk shop, let's not do it. So I found out that I made more of my friends upset at me in the process than not, just because you come into the climate conversation, which is so ideological, and you offset things as subtle as, do you know how hard it's been for the last 40 years to get the UNFCCC project process to work? Do you know what it means for developing countries? Do you understand what the efforts that have been exerted over years? I don't. And that's why we brought in, some of the best people in the world. But I can tell you that as long as the policy relies on energy policy, which is where climate change right now is centered because of mitigation, we can potentially make some changes, including down the line, if I'm looking at a political horizon, by the end of the summer. This is where we start bringing the parties who wouldn't join the party, if you may, the oil producers, the sovereign wealth funds, the people who actually can make an impact. And as much as I hated the word lobbying, especially when you go to a country like London, where I'm based, there's always proper decorum. I use government relations. Part of what we had to do, just for you to know, in the process is our Chinese friends didn't engage in the beginning because it's just the climate is not positive. Our Asian friends ended up having their own sort of roving exercise, which was very successful in Singapore. We slowly onboarded the support of the Biden administration. We had it in the beginning as a transition team, but then there was a cool period, and then they re-engaged at a later stage at different levels, including the National Security Council and later on with the Kerr team. We finally got some feedback from the Chinese part because we had what some may call conservative or right description of the problem last session, which had people like, Professor Neil Ferguson and others call it what it is, say that there is a big problem. And unless we get over the geopolitical issue, we won't get it done. So my motivation has always been, we have to come up with policy that works. Otherwise, my conservative friends in the US or elsewhere won't take me seriously because they know this is what it takes to deliver a message. So what I'm trying to say is, in the process, we had the secret to a good policy proposal is time and timing. And the time is now for climate change. And the timing, we have 6 months, and the place is Glasgow and Scotland. Thanks to friends like Sir David Edward and my friend Stephen Gethens, even though we are having our own struggles in Scotland, there is an appreciation that this is a time that we have to create an environment that brings things together. My problem as an academic is I believe in international organization as a discipline, as part of international relations, as in part of international law, their theory of functionalism. Function creates the organization. And believe me, for the last 2-3 months, we spent heated debates about what kind of an international organization can deliver us to this point. So you've seen Sarah Millar, who's been an absolute champion to sort of trying to find a way to keep the UNFCCC integrity, the system together. And Andy, who's been doing this for such a long time, to trying to hold on to some structure that can actually deliver us and take us forward, especially as we are serious about this idea of Scotia to Africa. So I want to beg your indulgence over the next few months for two things. One, stick with it. Let us finish this policy proposal, this policy planning exercise. Two, we're going to give proposals that look very ugly. The sausage, it's almost politically unacceptable. But you know what? We're sharing the secret sauce at IQ. This is how we do it. This is how we got things like a dispute resolution system set up with the Belt and Road Initiative. In China, it took us 3 years until we established the credibility to be taken seriously, to come up with a system that is coherent with the rule of law as we understand it in the West. However, it does take a long time and a confidence building exercise that requires more than 6 months. And I don't want to fail this group by giving you a charter or a document that looks great, but does not deliver what we hope we can deliver, because I do believe the timing is on our side to come up with a proposal for the next 9 years. And I really hope that Sarah, with her pact, where we can hopefully support, will come up with some of those resolutions. So I'm asking Ted to put some of those general points that we've shared. There is something called Policy Proposal 1, which envisions this idea that we haven't agreed on, including our inception team, of what could be done. And again, you have to forgive me. As a lawyer, I'm limited by certain legal instruments that make things happen. And in the business of regulatory law, you implement. McKinsey can come up with the most beautiful plans in the world and slides, but the implementation is a real job. It requires so much to get done. And if you get it wrong, it makes the whole process not even worth it. So with that in mind, please do look at our proposals. You will notice that there is a finesse in connecting the ideas that people who are so renowned like Andy and Sarah and others. We have so many proposals that will make our way, and Hattie will tell us about it at the Majlis. And let me just sort of add one last point, and I'm sorry, Kirsty, for messing the facilitation flow, but we have one proposal which actually is working and I'm very excited about, which is my dear friend James Wright, who gave us a proposal about Scotia, the Scotty dog, who gives us hope. He's our mascot as a Sherpa. Hopefully this will be adopted as a story that our children and the next generations will remember the moment where things changed, and will remember Scotland very fondly. Even though I'm not in Scotland, I'm wearing my tartan. So that shows you our commitment to making Scotland really the home of a huge transformation for climate action. Thank you very much, and sorry for taking so long.
Thank you so much, Professor Dahlan. And I think everyone takes your words very clearly. This is not a talk shop, that we want 3 to 4 good proposals coming out of this discussion. And the time is now. And you talk about Scotia to Africa, and we thank you for bringing us together. I'd now like to open this up to questions. And if I may, perhaps we can go to Victoria Preston, who has a question and who is interested in both the pact and the linked arms approach. To you, Victoria, please.
Thank you, Kirsty. I thought Andy's linked arms idea is very exciting, and really as a practical matter, because it connects people at the same level of intention, or the communities at the same level of intention. I think part of the problem with the climate change agenda is this very sort of heavy top down or kind of combative, where you have competing incentives for different economies and so on. So my question to Andy was really, I mean, do you see the linked arms approach working at the kind of real grassroots community level, or are you talking country to country?
Thank you for the question, Victoria. I certainly see it at sub-national level. So we're seeing extraordinary communities of cities working together, of communities and regions as well working together. So I see it very much not just at country to country, but actually at city to city, region to region. And indeed, sometimes you see community of practice with community of practice as well. So very much at the sub-national as well as at the national.
Thanks, Andy. I just on a follow-up of that, I always think about the power of the environmental movement as being like a kind of a faith-based movement. Of course, it's based in science, but we take it on faith. We don't all go away and read the science and then make up our minds. We make up our minds on kind of emotional, at an emotional level and a sort of instinctive level. And really, my question is always, how do you, when you are kind of propagating a sensibility around climate change and for people to live in a way that kind of promotes the climate change agenda, what can we learn from faith-based organizations, which really are very, very powerful, and people in those organizations feel very, very connected? I mean, have you thought about how that works? Because it's really about persuasion, isn't it? And
yes, it is. I mean, I have to say, in the previous Scotia group, that we had a very powerful talk about the use of faith groups and so on. So I think that came out last time round. I think from our perspective, what we are seeing is that at the local and at the regional and at the community level, the focus isn't on, do you believe or not in climate change? The focus is on, what sort of place do we want to live in 5, 10, 15, 20 years? And how do we achieve it in a way that almost as a byproduct happens to be net zero, or it's resilient to climate impacts? So it's very much about focused on livelihoods. It's focused on, for those of us in the chilly north, it'll be warm, affordable homes, effective transport systems, and so on. So it's very practical rather than is there faith or not in the climate message? It's much more, how do you actually build a thriving, resilient local community, a place, whether it's a city, a region, whether it's and connecting actions that are happening on the ground in one place with other cities and regions around the world. And we already have multiple really good, strong networks happening already. The Under 2 coalition, the coalition, a global coalition of mayors, or global covenant of mayors. There's lots of these sorts of networks already emerging. So we're not trying to cut across that. It's much more about building on what is already existing, but drawing on the very pragmatic, the changes that need to be made and how do we support that, rather than the slightly more ethereal, do you believe in it or not believe in it, or what's the statement around that?
Thank you so much, Victoria, and to Andy. If I could now go, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, to Dr. Kariuki from Kenya, and this wealth of experience. We heard from you last time. If I could go to you for your question, and then to the Baroness Denise, please.
Thank you very much, everyone. Good morning, good evening, and good afternoon. My name is Kariuki Moigwa. I have just been invited into this group, and I'm happy to be here. I teach law at the University of Nairobi, environmental law, but I'm also a practitioner in one area, conflict management. I do work with the communities, and what I hear here this afternoon is encouraging. A dream of combating climate change effectively, a dream of working with the grassroots, the bottom up. And that is part of what I do, so that away from the classroom, I've been forced to ask myself, what is this I'm saying practically? How do the communities understand it? What is climate change in, say, Kiswahili, a language that we use in our place? And it surprised me to know that communities do know what we are talking about if you phrase it differently. So the question of language is very important, so that we then have what is called environmental democracy. The people who are affected by climate change have some voice. How do we ensure that voice is heard by us instead of talking down on them? So whatever the speakers who spoke before me have said resonates very well with me. There should be environmental awareness, there should be engagement, meaningful engagement, not just with regulators, but with those communities. And I can tell you, it is possible. I work with them, I'll continue working with them, and through this group, I'll reach the communities in my country and other places. And we move forward, but it's workable, it's possible, and I do believe in it. Thank you.
Dr. Migwa, thank you so much for your expertise and adding your voice. I don't know if Andy or Sarah would like to respond before I go to Baroness Kingsmill. No. Okay, thank you, Baroness Kingsmill. If I could go to you, please.
Thank you, and I'm delighted to be here. The last session was very, very stimulating, and our speakers today have been just as exciting and committed and engaged, and I'm delighted to be part of these discussions of the Scotia Group. But there's a couple of things that I just want to quickly say. First of all, I'm a lawyer and an economist. And a parliamentarian. And I feel that what we have to do is use those areas of power, and I use that in a very limited, in a very sort of special way, because all of us have power to some extent, some more than others, but we have to use those areas to ensure that the debate on climate change continues and is brought very strongly to the fore everywhere. So, for example, earlier this week, as part of the Economic Affairs Committee on quantitative easing, and talking to the Governor of the Bank of England, we wanted to raise with him the issues of climate change. So bringing that into an area which perhaps they're not always thinking about when they're concentrating on financial issues, bringing things like climate change very much to the forefront of decision making in all sorts of the institutions that we are engaged in. So that's something we can all do in our sort of institutional in our institution experience. I said last time that I am the director of sustainability at Inditex. So again, we bring that very much to the fore in a commercial context. But I think too, one has to recognize we've been focusing a lot when we talk about climate change on power and energy. And I think that is obviously a very important issue, but I would not want agriculture to be left off the agenda and the discussions about agriculture. I come from New Zealand. The power issues in New Zealand are tremendous. I mean, we use mostly hydropower, and it's very, the country is very conscious about climate change, having had some problems with the environment in the past. It's very environmentally conscious, and every citizen is too. However, it is economically dependent on ruminants, on cows and sheep, which have a huge, huge impact on the environment. We have to figure out ways of approaching those sort of areas, as well as the ones which are so obvious about, the internal combustion engine and so on. And I sometimes feel that the debate gets a little bit narrow and focused too much on particular industries without taking a broader picture. And so I'd be really interested to hear other people's views about things along those areas as well. The two things: using your own power in your institutions and all the organizations that you can influence, but also what are we going to do about agriculture? How are we going to, include that in our focus in relation to COP26?
Thank you so much, Baroness. And I so appreciate your questions. I'm just cognizant of time. Do you think I could take 2 more questions and then give it back to Andy and Sarah? I hope that's respectful. If I could go to Joe Puri and to David Mednikoff for their questions, and then we'll turn it over to Andy and Sarah. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Kirsty. I really appreciate this. And I do also want to add that this is the second conversation that I'm attending. And I really appreciate the openness with which we're coming to these discussions and also the dialogue that you're fostering within these discussions. So I actually want to take off from where the Baroness left off. And thank you so much for bringing for, I think, the importance of looking at agriculture. But I think one of the previous speakers spoke about, and the professor Malik Dahlan actually spoke about, how do we figure out whether policies are being effective on the ground, because non-implementable policies are not useful at all. And I'm an economist by training. And one of the key things that we learn, as the Baroness alluded to as well, is that it is the importance of incentives that we need to look at when we are thinking about the success of implementation of policies. And so in the climate change arena as well, I think it becomes really important to understand what are the incentives that are in place or that we are fostering that can lead to the success of some of the movements that we are looking at, or even, as Andy spoke about, linking arms across subnational communities and organizations. What are the incentives in place that we can generate to ensure that? And I think we've got to have an honest discussion about that, because people have lives and they're busy and they're worried about livelihoods, and we're asking them to do something far more. And adaptation and agriculture here play a very, very important role when we are looking at people's livelihoods and really focusing on agriculture and ensuring that any transition that we are talking about has at the core of it people who are producing food for us. Small-scale farmers produce 1/3 of the food that comes to our tables. And they are actually the most impacted by the climate vulnerability and uncertainty that we are seeing today. And so really putting them at the center of a lot of this discussion, and then seeing that these transitions are just, and then ensuring that these transitions have as part of them to also rectify, I think, the wealth accumulation that has occurred in previous transitions. The wage component of these transitions is increased so that we are then helping to trickle down some of the benefits of these transitions is really key. So I want to leave you with that thought, the importance of incentives and the importance of just transitions. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. I love these good questions. David, I'm going to ask for a short one to give our two speakers time to respond, because then we're all going to transition to the Madge list. David, to you, please.
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And thanks, Professor Dahlan and Your Majesties and Your Highnesses for organizing this. So I'm just wondering about how, with a hand-to-hand approach, which I really also appreciated, issues around cultural differences and context might be addressed. And so my question actually is whether some type of a regional approach to trying to work through these issues together, not international, not national, but regional, might be another useful avenue to explore around new approaches and ways of specifically dealing with questions around culture, equity, and mutual understanding that have bedeviled, I know, that this entire process. Thanks.
David, thank you. Really, thank you for those excellent questions. Sarah, would you like to go, and then I'll hand it to Andy, and then I hate to wrap up such a good discussion, but we're going to have to, please. Sarah, to you.
Thank you, and thank you for very insightful, intelligent questions from the group. I wanted to come back on Professor Kariuki's point about not talking down to people. And I think I'm no great defender of the UNFCCC process. It has its flaws. But essentially the flaws are because of the governments involved, not necessarily the process itself. And so we go back to what Professor Malik was saying about, form and function and the people who participate. My worry this year is, and I said it during the presentation, so many of the climate decisions are going to be taken by the major economies. And a lot of people are like, well, that's a great idea because, they're the ones with the big emissions. And if they get in a group and solve it, it can all be done quicker, faster. Isn't that fantastic? I don't think that that is the right approach, because I think having a tiered system means that you don't have that opportunity for everybody to come back together. And at the end of the day, this is a global challenge that affects every single person on the planet. And so it's not protecting the UNFCCC for the sake of protecting the UNFCCC. It's protecting it because it is the only international forum to talk about this, where every party, every country has an equal seat at the table. And so to avoid having that talking down, where, oh, well, you know, the US has come back and will reconstitute the Major Economies Forum, and, you know, we'll look at a G2 dynamic, and, you know, we'll only talk in G7 about climate finance, and that conversation will only concern the donors and it won't concern the country recipients. That can't be the right way forward, because otherwise the power dynamic is all wrong. So in order to prevent some of that happening, you have to have a forum like the UNFCCC. If it didn't exist, we would probably have to create it. If we thought about tearing it down a few years later, we would probably have to recreate something very, very similar. So when people talk about this, I always think it's a bit of a false economy to think, well, we could replace it with something and then it would all work better. I think you'd probably replace it with something very similar to what we have now. And instead of doing the decade of action, you would have a decade of bureaucracy and restarting things. So I think quite often it's, you know, better to work from within and try and fix it than get rid.
Thank you.
The remarks I had.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Very quickly to Andy, and then we'll be moving to our Majlis, please.
Okay, just very, very quickly then. So thanks to Baroness Kingsmill and Joe Puri. Absolutely, yes. And land use and landscapes and how you get those to work with the people and towards environmental objectives is hugely challenging. I'm doing some work in Ireland where you can't have an agri-food sector as it currently stands, and for Ireland to meet its climate target. So there is a fundamental existential challenge for many countries in that space. There aren't any easy answers to that. And so the questions then is, how do you work through all of the levers of change that we have, both from through innovation, from consumer preferences, to a whole range of topics. But yeah, to both of you, yes, absolutely. I'd love to pick up later. To David's point, yes, absolutely. I think that's where we see natural networks already existing. The only thing on the regional side is what you don't want to is leave particular regions behind. So you need to make sure you're interspersing that with those connections across regions as well as within regions. But that is the natural starting point where you can build collaborations of interest, networks and communities that are all essentially driving with similar cultural, social context. Yeah.
Thank you, Andy. And to all of you, let me begin by expressing our deep appreciation to Her Majesty. We'd like to thank Professor Dahlan for bringing us all together, and our two excellent speakers. And thank you to you all for your really good input. We want to assure you your questions are being captured, your comments are being captured, and we're really grateful for your reflections. And now we're going to move into the Majlis. If you're joining us, you'll have to log off and go to the second link. Thank you, one and all. This has been terrific. We'll see you soon. Bye then.